This is a true story, something that happened to me a few years back. It's funny how the worst moment of your life can sometimes become the foundation for everything that comes after. The clink of ice against crystal was the only sound I could hear over the ringing in my ears. 20 of our closest friends were gathered on the back patio of our Terrytown home, the Austin skyline glittering like a fallen constellation behind them. Mark stood in the center of it all, bathed in the warm glow of the string lights, holding up his glass of Chardonnay. It was supposed to be a celebration of his latest real estate deal, but as he smiled that predatory smile, I knew it was an execution. "And I just want to thank my beautiful wife, Amy," he began, his voice dripping with a sincerity so fake it was almost impressive. His eyes found mine across the crowd, and they were cold, flat, and triumphant. Without her, I wouldn't have realized how much a man can achieve when he finally decides to cut out the dead weight. A collective gasp rippled through our friends. Then, turning his condescending gaze fully on me, he delivered the killing blow, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm leaving her, of course. Good luck affording a place to live without me, sweetheart. You'll be lucky to rent a closet." If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The 10 years before that moment felt like a different lifetime. A sepia-toned photograph of a woman I no longer recognized. I met Mark Reed when I was 27, a budding landscape designer with a small but growing list of clients who appreciated my knack for blending native Texas flora with modern, sustainable design. He was a force of nature, a brash, ambitious developer with a blueprint in one hand and a vision for conquering Austin in the other. He swept me off my feet with promises of a partnership, not just in life, but in business. "You and me, Amy," he'd say, tracing the lines of my palm in our cramped rental apartment. "We're going to build an empire. You'll design the grounds, I'll build the towers. We'll be unstoppable," I believed him. I fell for the dream as much as I fell for the man, so I folded my fledgling business into his. My client list became his. My designs, which won local accolades and attracted wealthy investors, were always presented under the banner of Mark Reed Development. I became the silent partner, the creative genius behind the scenes, as he so generously called me at cocktail parties. My days were spent on dusty construction sites, arguing with foremen about soil pH and irrigation lines, while his were spent in glass-walled boardrooms, charming investors, and schmoozing city council members. I managed the house, the finances, or so I thought, the social calendar, and the immense unspoken pressure of maintaining the perfect image his brand required. I told myself it was a sacrifice for our future. I told myself that my contribution, while less visible, was just as valuable. It was the lie I needed to believe to keep going. Over the years, his casual dismissals of my work became sharper, more frequent. "Nobody cares about the petunias, Amy," he'd scoff when I'd try to discuss a planting budget. "Just make it look expensive." My ideas were cute, my concerns overly emotional. He slowly, methodically chiseled away at my confidence until I started to believe it myself. I was the wife, the helper, the aesthetic accessory to his brilliant career. The money, once a shared resource, became his. Our joint account was for household expenses, a glorified allowance he'd scrutinize every month, while the real money, the profits from the deals I had helped conceptualize and beautify, disappeared into the labyrinthine accounts of his corporation, a place I was never invited to enter. When I'd ask about our long-term financial health, about retirement or investments, he'd pat my head and say, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. I've got it all handled." That night on the patio, as he stood there basking in the horrified silence of our guests, I realized handled meant hidden. The dead weight he was cutting loose wasn't just a wife. It was a witness. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to erase me, to leave me with nothing so that his version of the story of the self-made tycoon burdened by a dependent wife, would be the only one ever told. The party dissolved in a flurry of awkward goodbyes and averted eyes. No one met my gaze. They were his friends, his investors, his colleagues. I was just the wife. I stood there, rooted to the flagstone I had personally selected 3 years earlier, until the last car pulled away. Mark walked back outside, loosening his tie. He didn't look angry or sorry. He looked relieved. "I've had my lawyer draw up the papers," he said, his voice casual, as if discussing the weather. "It's a very generous offer, take it. It'll be less embarrassing for you in the long run. He walked past me into the house, our house, and I heard the decisive click of the master bedroom door closing. It was the last time we ever slept under the same roof. I spent the night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, the echo of his words, "You'll be lucky to rent a closet," playing on a torturous loop. For the first time, I didn't cry. The shock was too deep, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. He had spent a decade convincing me I was nothing without him. And in the terrifying silence of that $1 million house, I was starting to believe he was right. I thought about my old dreams, my own name, my own business. They felt like ghosts. He hadn't just planned a divorce. He had orchestrated my complete annihilation. And the worst part was, I had let him. I had handed him the tools to do it, one sacrifice at a time. The fight wasn't just about to begin. I was already years behind, and he had a monumental head start. The first meeting with my new lawyer, a kind but overwhelmed woman named Sarah, felt like confirmation of my deepest fears. We sat in her drab beige office, a stack of financial disclosures from Mark's legal team on the desk between us. It was a masterpiece of fiction. According to the documents, Mark Reed Development was drowning in debt. The massive deal he'd just celebrated was apparently a last-ditch effort to stay afloat. His personal income was a fraction of what I knew it to be, and our shared assets were minimal. The Terrytown house was mortgaged to the hilt, the cars were leased, and the investment accounts were nearly empty. "It's an aggressive posture, Amy," Sarah said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on a spreadsheet that screamed poverty. "He's claiming the business has a negative valuation. He's offering you the equity in the house, which appears to be next to nothing, and a paltry sum of alimony for 2 years. He's daring us to challenge him." My mind reeled. I thought of the trips to Monaco, the custom suits, the Patek Philippe watch he'd bought himself for his 40th birthday. I thought of the constant talk of expansion, of new projects, of conquering the Dallas market next. It didn't make sense. "It's a lie, Sarah," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "All of it. He's not broke. He's the most successful developer in Austin." Sarah gave me a sympathetic, weary smile. "I believe you. But believing it and proving it are two very different things. His lawyers are from V&E. They're sharks. They've built a fortress of paper around him. To fight this, to really dig in and find what he's hidden, it would take hundreds of hours of forensic accounting. It would cost a fortune, Amy. A fortune you don't have." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A fortune you don't have. Mark knew it. It was the cornerstone of his plan. He had financially starved me for years, ensuring I'd have no war chest to fight him with. He wasn't just leaving me. He was leaving me powerless. I left Sarah's office and drove aimlessly, the Austin traffic a blur of brake lights and frustration that mirrored the chaos in my own head. My credit cards had already been declined at the grocery store that morning. A quiet, humiliating beep that announced my new reality to the world. He had cut me off, completely. I was a 40-year-old woman with a stunning resume hidden under her husband's name. 2 decades of experience, and about $400 in a personal checking account I'd kept for emergencies. This, I realized, was the emergency. I ended up at Zilker Park, sitting on a bench overlooking the city skyline, a skyline Mark was so proud of helping to shape. I could see the sleek silhouette of the Azure, his signature downtown high-rise, its rooftop garden, a project I had poured my heart and soul into for 2 years. I had fought tooth and nail for the rainwater harvesting system, the native plant species, the green roof that had won the project a prestigious environmental award. An award he accepted, thanking his brilliant team. As I sat there, a slow burn of anger began to replace the cold dread. He had not only stolen my future, he had stolen my past, retroactively erasing my contributions from our shared history. He was counting on me to be the woman he had carefully molded, compliant, intimidated, and too broken to fight back. He was expecting me to take the generous offer and disappear, just another casualty of his ambition. He was picturing me in a tiny, sad apartment, just as he'd predicted. And in that moment, staring at the monument to my own invisible labor, something inside me shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it found a new companion. Rage. A pure, clarifying rage that burned away the fog of despair. Proving him wrong was no longer just about money. It was about existence. It was about reclaiming the story of my own life. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't know where the money would come from. But I knew I couldn't walk away. I would not be erased. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling slightly, and called Sarah. "Don't accept the offer," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "We're going to fight. I want a forensic accountant. The best one you can find." The war had just been declared, and I was its sole, underfunded, and hopelessly outgunned soldier. But for the first time since that night on the patio, I had a mission. I was going to find every single dollar he had buried. The forensic accountant Sarah found was a woman named Eleanor Vance. She was in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of no-nonsense glasses, and a demeanor that suggested she found puzzles more interesting than people. Her office was a small, cluttered space in a nondescript building far from the gleaming towers of downtown Austin, filled not with law degrees, but with framed academic awards in mathematics and cryptography. She didn't offer sympathy or comforting platitudes. She simply took the mountain of financial disclosures from Mark's team, placed it on her desk, and said, "Men like your husband are all the same. They believe their own brilliance makes them invisible. They always leave a trail." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Eleanor cost a small fortune, requiring a retainer that I had to beg and borrow from my parents, a humiliating act that felt like another victory for Mark. He had not only isolated me from our friends, but had forced me back into a state of childlike dependence. It was a calculated cruelty, and it only hardened my resolve. Our initial strategy sessions were a deep dive into the last decade of my life. Eleanor wasn't just interested in the numbers. She was interested in the story behind them. "Tell me about his habits," she'd command, her pen poised over a legal pad. Trips, hobbies, friends he complained about, friends he bragged to. The arrogant ones can't resist boasting. They leave clues in their own conversations. So I talked for hours. I recounted every trip, every dinner, every offhand comment I had dismissed as idle chatter at the time. I was his social secretary, the keeper of the calendar, the one who packed his bags and booked his flights. I knew his life's logistics better than anyone. A memory surfaced, hazy at first, from about 5 years ago. He took a trip, a golf trip, he called it, with some investors, I recalled. To the Cayman Islands. Eleanor's pen stopped moving. She looked up at me over the rim of her glasses. "Does your husband play golf, Amy?" I blinked. "No," I said, the word hanging in the air. "He hates golf. He always said it was a waste of a good walk." A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. "There we are," she said softly. "That's our thread. It was the first of many. We worked tirelessly, often late into the night in her dusty office, fueled by stale coffee and a shared obsessive focus. I learned to read financial statements, to understand the intricate dance of credits and debits, of assets and liabilities. My designer's eye for detail, once used to spot the subtle nuances of color and texture in a garden, was now trained on finding anomalies in spreadsheets. I discovered a pattern: small, regular payments, listed as consulting fees or material sourcing, made out to a series of limited liability companies, or LLCs, with vaguely industrial names like Apex Holdings and Keystone Logistics. They were death by 1,000 cuts, siphoning money from Mark Reed development so slowly it would be invisible in a cursory audit. But when added up over a decade, it was millions. "These are his pockets," Eleanor explained, circling the names with a red pen. "He's paying himself before he pays the company. The trick is finding where the pockets lead. The problem was that the LLCs were ghosts. They were registered in Delaware, shielded by corporate privacy laws that made them nearly impossible to trace. We hit a wall, a fortress of legal and financial obfuscation that seemed impenetrable. Mark's lawyers, in the meantime, were turning up the heat. They filed motion after motion, burying Sarah in paperwork, accusing me of deliberately stalling the proceedings. They subpoenaed my personal emails and text messages, looking for anything to paint me as unstable or vindictive. In a particularly brutal court filing, they included a psychiatrist's report from years earlier when I had sought therapy for anxiety, ironically, brought on by Mark's controlling behavior. They were trying to publicly brand me as a hysterical woman scorned, a gold digger who couldn't accept that her husband's business was failing. It was a classic and effective strategy. I felt my reputation in Austin, a city built on connections and image, crumbling. People I'd known for years would cross the street to avoid me. The isolation was suffocating. I was losing, and Mark knew it. He was winning the war of public opinion, and we were no closer to finding his treasure chest. One night, Drowning my sorrows in a cheap bottle of wine in my small rented apartment, I almost gave up. I drafted an email to Sarah, telling her to accept whatever offer Mark's team put on the table. My finger hovered over the send button, the promise of an end to the humiliation, the legal fees, and the loneliness almost too tempting to resist. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Eleanor. It simply said, "Don't you dare." That single text, a command rather than a plea, was the jolt I needed. I deleted the draft and opened my laptop, my mind racing. If the legal route was a dead end, I needed another way in. I needed a human source. I started thinking about the people Mark had discarded over the years, the ones who, like me, had been deemed dead weight. My mind landed on a name, Maria. She had been Mark's executive assistant for over 15 years, a fiercely loyal and impeccably organized woman who knew every skeleton in his closet. Mark had fired her 6 months before he left me, replacing her with a 20-something with no experience. He claimed it was a cost-cutting measure, but I knew he'd done it because Maria had started to question his expense reports. She had seen too much. Finding her wasn't easy. She had moved out of the city. I finally tracked her down through a former caterer who had worked our parties. Maria was now living in a small town in the hill country, working at a local library. I drove 3 hours to meet her at a dusty roadside diner, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She was hesitant at first, scared of Mark's reach and his vindictiveness. But as I laid out the story of his betrayal, of the public humiliation and the financial warfare, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. I saw her own quiet dismissal reflected in my story. "He thought I was stupid," she said, her voice barely a whisper, stirring her iced tea with a long, thin spoon. "He thought I was just a secretary. He used to make notes on his desk calendar, codes, names of LLCs next to dates. He thought I never paid attention." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. "I started writing them down a few years ago," she said, sliding it across the sticky Formica tabletop. "I don't know why. A feeling, I guess. That it was wrong." I opened the notebook. Inside, in Maria's neat, precise cursive, were dozens of entries. Dates, acronyms, and strings of numbers. And one name, repeated over and over again. Sovereign Trust Partners. It wasn't one of the Delaware LLCs we had been chasing. This was something new. A quick search on my phone revealed it was a wealth management firm based in the Cayman Islands. It was the key. It was the lockbox in the Caymans he had visited on his golf trip. Maria had just handed me the map to Mark's hidden empire. The drive back to Austin felt different. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the rolling hills, and for the first time, it didn't feel like the end of the day. It felt like the beginning of one. The game had changed. Mark thought he was fighting a broken, emotional amateur. He had no idea he was now up against 2 meticulous, underestimated women with nothing left to lose and a book full of his secrets. The notebook from Maria was more than a map. It was a Rosetta Stone. With the name Sovereign Trust Partners and the specific dates Maria had logged, Eleanor could finally petition the court for something tangible: international banking records. Mark's legal team fought it viciously, claiming it was a baseless fishing expedition designed to harass their client. But the judge, a stern older woman who seemed unimpressed by the bluster of Mark's high-priced lawyers, saw the pattern of deception. She granted our request. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first crack in Mark's fortress. The wait for the records was agonizing. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. During that time, the legal battle intensified. Mark, sensing a shift in momentum, became more aggressive. He filed for an emergency hearing to have me evicted from our Terrytown home, where I had been allowed to stay pending the divorce settlement. His lawyers argued I was a destabilizing presence and that he needed to sell the property to cover his alleged debts. The deposition was held in a soulless conference room in his lawyer's downtown office. The table was a vast expanse of polished mahogany, a deliberate power play designed to make me feel small. I sat on one side with Sarah. Mark sat on the other with 3 lawyers, including the lead partner, a silver-haired shark named Clayton. Mark wouldn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, a smirk playing on his lips, the very picture of arrogant confidence. Clayton began the questioning, his voice a low, condescending drawl. He grilled me about my career before Mark, my meager earnings, my lack of formal business education. He portrayed me as a hobbyist, a dilettante who had lucked into a life of luxury she hadn't earned. "Mrs. Reed," he said, leaning forward, "is it not true that prior to your marriage, your landscape design business barely broke even? That you had, in fact, incurred significant debt to keep it afloat?" "It was a new business," I said, my voice steady despite the furious pounding in my chest. "All new businesses have startup costs." "So you were failing," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "And then you met Mr. Reed. He absorbed your failing business. He paid off your debts. He gave you a lifestyle you could only have dreamed of. Is that a fair summary?" Every word was a twisting knife. He was erasing me, painting me as a parasite. I glanced at Mark. He was thoroughly enjoying the show, whispering to the lawyer next to him and chuckling softly. He caught my eye and gave me a slow, deliberate wink, a silent message of triumph. "See," the wink said, "you are nothing. I am everything." And in that moment, the hurt, the fear, the humiliation, it all coalesced into something hard and sharp inside me. My despair burned away, leaving behind an ice-cold clarity. This wasn't a man who had fallen out of love with me. This was an enemy who took genuine pleasure in my destruction. My purpose, I realized with chilling certainty, was no longer just to get a fair settlement. It was to take this man, this smug, self-satisfied monster, and systematically dismantle the empire of lies he had built around himself. I wanted to see that smirk wiped from his face. I wanted him to feel, just for a moment, the same powerlessness he had inflicted on me for a decade. I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the cool surface of the mahogany table, and met Clayton's gaze. "No, Mr. Clayton," I said, my voice calm and devoid of the emotion he was trying to provoke. "That is not a fair summary. My business was not failing. It was growing. And its client list, which I built through my own talent and hard work, became the foundation for your client's initial success in the luxury market. My designs won the awards that made his company a household name in Austin. So let's be very clear. He didn't absorb a failing business. He absorbed his greatest asset." The room went silent. Clayton was momentarily stunned, unused to being challenged so directly. I saw a flicker of annoyance cross Mark's face. It was the first time I had ever truly defied him, ever refused to accept the narrative he had written for me. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was a declaration of war. That night, I went back to my lonely rental apartment and didn't open a bottle of wine. Instead, I opened my laptop and created a new file. It was a spreadsheet. I began to meticulously document every project I had worked on for Mark Reed Development, every design I had created, every award we had won because of my work. I gathered testimonials from old clients, from contractors, from city planners. I was no longer just fighting for my future. I was reclaiming my past. I was building my case, not just as a wronged wife, but as a founding partner in the business he claimed was his alone. He wanted to erase me from the story. I was about to write myself back in, not as a footnote, but as the headline. The documents from the Cayman Islands arrived 3 weeks later in a thick, sealed FedEx package. Eleanor and I sat in her office, a palpable tension in the air, and opened it. Inside was a mountain of paper, a decade's worth of wire transfers, account statements, and investment portfolios. Mark wasn't just hiding money. He had built a damn fortress out of it. The Cayman Islands documents were a revelation. It was a complex, brilliant, and deeply illegal system. Mark had been using the Delaware LLCs as pass-through entities. Money from Mark Reed Development would be paid to one of the LLCs for consulting. That LLC would then pay another for services rendered. After a series of these transactions, designed to muddy the waters and make the money untraceable, it would be wired to sovereign trust partners in the Caymans, where it was invested in offshore funds under a corporate umbrella that had no legal connection to his name. It was genius in its audacity. He wasn't just hiding marital assets. He was committing felony tax evasion and wire fraud on a massive scale. He had siphoned off more than $25 million over 10 years. Eleanor let out a low whistle as she traced the path of a multi-million-dollar transfer on a flowchart she had sketched out. "He's not just a snake," she said, a note of grudging respect in her voice. "He's a boa constrictor. He's been squeezing the life out of his own company for a decade to feed this monster." Our strategy shifted overnight. This was no longer a divorce case. It was a criminal one, but we had to be careful. If we went to the authorities immediately, the government would freeze all his assets, including the ones he'd hidden, and they'd become tied up in a federal case for years. I might never see a dime. Mark, on the other hand, would likely face prison time. While the thought was deeply satisfying, my primary goal was to secure my independence, to have the resources to rebuild my life and my career. We needed to use the threat of criminal charges as leverage to force a settlement. We were no longer asking for a piece of the pie. We were in a position to demand the whole bakery. The plan was to wait for the final arbitration hearing, a mandatory step before the divorce could go to trial. Mark, still blissfully unaware of what we had found, was pushing for it. He wanted to end things, to force me to accept his lowball offer so he could move on. He saw it as his final victory lap. We saw it as the perfect ambush. The weeks leading up to the arbitration were the most intense of my life. I barely slept. I lived and breathed spreadsheets, legal documents, and timelines. I worked with Sarah and Eleanor to build an ironclad presentation of our findings. We compiled everything into a series of thick 3-ring binders, complete with color-coded tabs and a damning executive summary. One binder for our side, one for the arbitrator, and one for Mark. I wanted him to hold the physical weight of his own lies in his hands. During this time, I also took a bold step. I used the evidence of my contributions that I had been gathering, the project files, the awards, the client testimonials, and incorporated my own business again. Reed Landscape Architecture. The Reed was a deliberate choice. It was my name too, and I was done letting him own it. I built a website showcasing my portfolio, his portfolio, the one I had created. I was taking back my work, my history, my name. It was a quiet act of defiance, a digital flag planted in the ground, but it felt like a revolution. The day of the arbitration arrived. It was a Tuesday in October, a crisp, bright Austin morning. I chose my outfit carefully, a sharp navy blue suit, heels that made a confident click on the marble floors of the law firm, and my hair pulled back in a severe, professional bun. I was not coming to this meeting as a victim. I was coming as a CEO. I met Sarah and Eleanor in the lobby. Eleanor, holding a heavy briefcase containing our evidence, simply nodded at me. "Ready?" she asked. I was born ready, I lied, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. We rode the elevator up to the 34th floor in silence. When the doors opened, we stepped into the plush, hushed reception area of Vincent and Elkins. Mark and his legal team were already there, laughing and joking with the confidence of a team that knows it's about to win. Mark was wearing a new suit, tailored to perfection, and the smug smirk I had come to despise was firmly in place. He looked at me, his eyes sweeping over my suit with dismissive amusement, as if I were a child playing dress-up. He didn't see a threat. He saw the woman he had spent a decade making small. It was exactly what I wanted. He had absolutely no idea he was walking into his own execution. We were led into the conference room. It was the same one where my deposition had been held, with the same intimidating mahogany table. An older, stern-looking man, the arbitrator, sat at the head. We took our seats, the silence thick with unspoken hostility. Clayton, Mark's lead lawyer, began. He launched into a condescending speech about my unreasonable demands and my refusal to accept the financial reality of my husband's struggling business. He painted Mark as a generous man being taken advantage of by a vindictive ex-wife. Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, the very picture of a wronged man. He occasionally sighed with performative weariness, shaking his head sadly as if pained by my greed. I let them play out their entire performance. I sat perfectly still, my expression neutral, my hands resting calmly on the table in front of me. I let them build their scaffold of lies as high as they could. When Clayton finally finished, he slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is our final offer," he said with an air of theatrical finality. "It is more than generous. We advise you to take it, Mrs. Reed, and move on with your life." Sarah slid the paper back across the table. "We reject your offer," she said, her voice clear and strong. Clayton scoffed. "On what grounds?" "You have nothing." "That's where you're mistaken," Sarah replied, turning to Eleanor. Eleanor placed her heavy briefcase on the table, the latches snapping open with a sound that seemed to echo in the silent room. She pulled out the 3 binders, thick and heavy with incriminating evidence. She slid one to the arbitrator, one to Clayton, and I had the profound pleasure of pushing the 3rd one directly in front of my husband. "What is this?" Clayton demanded, flipping through the first few pages with a dismissive air. "This," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel, "is a detailed accounting of the $25 million. $342,000 your client has illegally funneled into offshore accounts through a series of shell corporations, primarily managed by sovereign trust partners in the Cayman Islands. The color drained from Mark's face. His smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed shock. He stared at the binder as if it were a venomous snake. Clayton's face hardened, but I could see the panic in his eyes as he frantically flipped through the pages, seeing the wire transfer receipts, the bank statements, the names of his phantom LLCs. "We have," Sarah continued, her voice cold as ice, "irrefutable proof of wire fraud, tax evasion, and perjury, given Mr. Reed's sworn financial disclosures. We were, of course, debating where to send our findings first. The IRS? The district attorney's office? We thought we'd get your input." She paused, letting the weight of the threat settle in the room. "However, my client is a reasonable woman. She is willing to forego reporting these discrepancies to the authorities in exchange for a revised settlement." I looked directly at Mark. His arrogant composure had completely shattered. He was pale, sweating, his eyes wide with the terror of a man watching his entire world crumble in real time. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was, for the first time in his life, utterly powerless. "Here are our terms," Sarah said, sliding a new piece of paper across the table. "A 60-40 asset split, in my client's favor, based on the full true net worth of $25 million. That includes the hidden assets. She gets the Terrytown house unencumbered. She gets full ownership of the intellectual property related to all landscape and architectural designs she created during the marriage. And you will fund the first 2 years of operating expenses for her new firm." Clayton stared at the paper, then at his client, who looked like he was about to be physically ill. He knew he was beaten. Checkmate. An hour later, the papers were signed. I walked out of that law firm and into the bright Austin sunlight, a free and very wealthy woman. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see but the wreckage of a man who had profoundly underestimated the woman he had tried to destroy. The legal battles weren't entirely over. The IRS, tipped off by an anonymous source, eventually launched its own investigation into Mark Reed development, but my war was won. The first thing I did wasn't to go on a shopping spree or take a lavish vacation. I took the settlement money and bought a house. Not just any house. It was a beautiful, slightly neglected 1920s craftsman in the historic Clarksville neighborhood, a place with good bones, a wraparound porch, and a yard crying out for a gardener's touch. It was the kind of house Mark had always sneered at, calling it small and sentimental. It was perfect. I paid in cash. The feeling of signing that final document, of knowing that this beautiful piece of Austin was mine and mine alone, was a victory far sweeter than any number in a bank account. My new firm landed its first major contract a few months later, a boutique hotel downtown that wanted a signature rooftop garden. The story of my divorce, once a source of shame, had become a legend in Austin business circles. I was no longer the silent partner. I was the woman who had brought Mark Reed to his knees. My reputation was not just restored. It was forged in fire. I spent my days on scaffolding, covered in dirt, bringing my own designs to life, and my evenings on the porch of my new home, sipping wine and listening to the quiet hum of the city. The end.